Hello everyone, and welcome to Relax for a While. I'm Joanne, and I'm so glad you're here with me tonight. If you're new to the channel, a warm welcome to you. In tonight's video, we're going to get cozy with the MAIDA series as we immerse ourselves in a sleepy audiobook from the second book of the series, MAIDA'S Little House. This sleepy audiobook will help transport you to a peaceful state of mind, perfect for unwinding after a long day. We'll embark on a magical journey with a little girl named Maida and all of her friends while they spend a happy summer together in a quaint little house in the country that has everything a child could wish for. Before we begin, I recommend keeping the volume at a lower level. This will help create a calming atmosphere that can lull you into sleepiness. With the soft sounds of my voice, a lower volume will make the experience even more soothing and help you relax more deeply. So, adjust your volume to a comfortable, quiet level, settle in, and let yourself be carried away by the story. Now, go ahead and close your eyes. Take a slow, deep, comfortable breath. Hold it for a moment and exhale slowly. Feel the tension melting away from your body as you prepare to drift off into a world of wonder and imagination. And so, my friend, lay back, relax, and let the soothing narration and calming sounds lull you into a peaceful sleep. Chapter 11, Visitors. After the second Thursday, which was Floribel's and Zeke's day out, came the second Saturday of the children's stay in the little house. And on that Saturday, all the parents came to Scituate from Charleston to see how their children were getting on. Mr. and Mrs. Brine, Mr. and Mrs. Lathrop, Mr. and Mrs. Clark, Mr. and Mrs. Doyle, Mr. and Mrs. Hale. Arthur had no mother, but Mr. Duncan appeared with the rest. Mr. Westabrook appeared at odd moments and helped entertain the guests. The children of these parents were so excited that Maida and Dickie lamented loudly that they had no relatives to show the little house. This was before the train which brought all these guests arrived. Afterwards, they had no time to regret anything. The hospitality of the little house was stretched to its furthest expansion. The boys, bunking in tents hastily erected on the lawn, gave up their beds to their fathers. The girls, sleeping on extra cots in the nursery, gave up their beds to their mothers. This did not take care of the entire company. All the rooms in the annex were filled. It was a 2 days equally busy for hosts and guests. The children were determined to show their parents everything, and the parents were equally determined to see everything. One instant, Mr. and Mrs. Doyle could be seen dragged off by Molly and Timmy to view House Rock. The next, Mr. and Mrs. Clark, herded by the twins, were being pulled in the direction of the fairy ring. Laura and Rosie displayed every detail of the house and barn to their parents. Arthur took his father on 2 long explorations through the woods. Betsy celebrated the arrival of Mr. and Mrs. Hale by her first attempt to run house in the magic mirror and brought back away. She was caught halfway between them in triumph, her big eyes sparkling with the mischief which always filled them when she was successful in accomplishing her purpose. Perhaps, though, Granny Flynn and Mrs. Dorr enjoyed more than anybody this break in their country life, for a happy smile never left Granny's wrinkled face, and Mrs. Dorr talked to the visitors all day long. The company left on a late Sunday afternoon train with an invitation to come every future weekend, and it looked as though life in the little house would go on as usual. However, Monday proved to be an equally exciting day as the two which had preceded it, for when the children, Big Six and Little Six, came back from their swim in the afternoon, they saw, lying placidly on the lawn, the figure of a strange man, asleep or awake they could not at first make out. The figure decided that for them by leaping to its feet in what seemed one athletic jerk. "It's Billy Potter!" shrieked Maida. "Billy! Billy!" the others made chorus, and they raced over to his side, threw themselves in one scrambled heap upon him. Being of athletic build, Billy Potter sustained that shock splendidly. Billy Potter was one of the oldest friends the little shop had had. He was a reporter on a Boston paper, a great favorite with Mr. Westabrook, whom he had many times interviewed, and a devoted friend of Maida's, whom he called Petronella. It was the first time the children had seen him since Maida left for Europe. He was rather short, Billy Potter, blue-eyed and golden-haired, the eyes very blue and very observant, his hair closely woven into thick curly thatch. The children alternately hugged and thumped him. "Why haven't you been here before, Billy?" Maida said. "I've been home 2 weeks now." "Only because I wasn't in Boston," Billy declared. "I've been away on my vacation. I had to take it early this year. I couldn't have come over here at this moment, but that I'm on a story." When Billy Potter spoke of a story, he meant the account which he wrote of events for his paper. "I'm on a kidnapping case," he explained over their heads to Mr. Westabrook. "I may be here in Scituate on and off for a few days, and if invited, I might become a guest of this noble establishment." "Oh, do come! Oh, do!" the children entreated. "All right," Billy agreed. "I'm only waiting for an invitation, Petronilla." "Well, here it is," said Maida. "I accept," Billy Potter laughed. The children had to take him the rounds too. He wondered at and exclaimed over the vegetable garden. He exclaimed over and wondered at the flower garden. He went in swimming in the magic mirror and showed them many new water tricks. He inspected House Rock with the Little Six. He climbed to the tree room with the Big Six. He declared that the tree room was where he must sleep, and he did sleep there, although it took all the ingenuity that he possessed, plus the assistance of 3 boys, to pull a cot up into it. And while Billy Potter was still a guest, as though, as Maida said, wonders would never cease, Dr. Pierce suddenly appeared on scene. Dr. Pierce was the Westabrook family physician. He had known Maida all her life and called her Pink Wink. He, too, had often visited the little shop, had been one of its advisors. The children deserted Billy for a moment and threw themselves pell-mell on the old physician. He stood braced for the shock which made every one of the tight gray curls on his head quiver and brought the twinkliest of twinkles to his happy old eyes. "Well, Pink-Wink," he exclaimed, "is this the little girl who used to have cheeks as white as paper and eyes like a burnt hole in a blanket? And are these those pale, washed-out, colorless, slim-jim-looking city children I used to know?" He hugged all the girls impartially, shook hands with the boys. Then he too made the rounds of the place. He played all his old games on them, drawing Betsy out to tell her exploits, listening with great enjoyment to Molly and Timmy, and never ceasing to pretend that Dorothy and Mabel were one girl with a magic power of being in two places at once. "You must come more often, Dr. Pierce," Maida said, when at last they found themselves seated in the living room. "Oh, I'm coming often enough," Dr. Pierce said. "You'll get good and tired of me before I have finished with you. I'm coming at regular intervals to see that you don't drown yourselves or get poison ivy, or sunstroke or lockjaw, or any of those things that children are so fond of. I shall make regular inspections. In fact, I'm going to make one this visit. Now that I speak of it, this strikes me as a good time. Line up over there against the wall, all of you, and stick out your tongues." Life fell into regular habits after a while. For work, 2 hours every morning, except on Thursdays, took care of that. On Thursdays, however, it was a matter of several hours. For play, it seemed as though the rest of the long golden days was all play. After the household tasks came bathing, which had become a habit as regular as eating. Bathing was almost the best fun they had, especially for Dickie. Dickie soon rejected the water wings. He was swimming now. Not, of course, as fast or as well as the others, but swimming with that fresh joy which only the amateur knows. The others were perfecting strokes of various kinds and practicing fancy diving of various sorts. Arthur was, of course, the best and strongest performer among them. Maida would never be more than a fair swimmer, nor Harold, but Rosie had soon outdistanced Laura, was beginning to work into Arthur's class. However, Laura was still, would probably always be, the most graceful of them all. The afternoons were spent in walking and playing tennis. The evenings were given up to reading and games. It looked at first as if their program would never vary. The beautiful weather kept up, and the beautiful country seemed full of diversion. Occasionally came a dark day, and then the boys devoted themselves to boxing in the barn. Their shouts and laughter would reach even the little house. On those occasions, Mrs. Dorr and Granny would gather the girls about them, set the older ones to mending, or to teach Molly and the Clark twins how to sew. The big six kept running into the burls, although the appearance of any of the little house children on the path leading to the gypsy camp was a signal for Silva and Timma to disappear instantly into the bushes. The children frequently came across the young gypsies, peddling their baskets in the village, at the pleasant Wampum Arms, which was the Scituate Hotel, or at the quiet farmhouses along the road. In the long walks that they occasionally took into the woods, Maida and her friends were likely to happen upon the outlaw pair. If the burls saw the girls coming, they quickly looked and walked the other way. The two gypsies were not, however, much bothered with attentions from the little house children, for since the experience at the magic mirror, The latter never voluntarily glanced in their direction. Once, Rosie came home almost breathless with rage. "What do you think has just happened, Maida?" she asked indignantly. "I was coming along the path when I saw a little opening in the bushes. It looked so pretty that I thought I'd cut into it. Just then, I saw Silva Burl running. Oh, running like 60, although she had a bottle of milk under her arm. She heard me coming, and suddenly she disappeared through the bushes. But before she got away, she made, oh, the horridest face at me. I was so mad." "She certainly is a strange girl," Maida remarked in a perplexed tone. "I don't understand why she acts so. We've never done anything to her. Why should she treat us like this?" Arthur also reported that once, early in the morning, he caught sight of Silva Burl flying along the path ahead of him, a bundle of, he could not tell what, under her arms. At the sound of his footsteps, Arthur said it was exactly as though she were afraid of something he might do, though, he added, what she expected him to do he couldn't guess. She flew to cover like a rabbit, actually vanished from his sight. But the most disagreeable of all was Laura's experience. Rosie pointed out to her the little opening among the trees which had so interested her. The next day, passing it alone, it occurred to Laura that she would find out where it led. Like Rosie, she walked through the underbrush, but she got farther than Rosie did. Suddenly, she came against a trailing tree branch. She started to climb over it. Splash! A pail of water, hung on over a hanging branch, fell on her, drenching her from head to foot. It spoiled the gloss of her freshly ironed muslin frock, of course, but it spoiled her temper more. Maida pondered all this evidence, utterly perplexed. Why the Burls should have taken such a dislike to them all, she could not guess. She did not speak of it to her father because she was afraid he might complain to Aunt Save, and Maida did not want to make trouble for her friend. But, under promise of secrecy, she discussed the situation with Billy Potter. For once, that astute young gentleman had no explanation of a curious social phenomenon. Billy Potter was coming to see them regularly now. So was Mr. Westabrook. They both had long talks with the children, collectively and separately. One afternoon, as they were sitting in the living room, a curious revelation occurred. Arthur was talking about the forest. It was plain to be seen that it fascinated him beyond measure. Often he would wake up in the early morning, slip down to the magic mirror, canoe himself across its dawn-swept, glossy surface to the other side, wander for an hour or more in the woods. "I guess I'll have to make you a forester out of you," Mr. Westabrook said that afternoon. "I hope you don't stay up late at night." His remark was not a question, only a comment. Arthur flushed, remained silent. Mr. Westabrook continued to look at him, and now his look was a question. "Twice," Arthur faltered finally, "when the moon was full. I wanted to see if I could come up to some of your deer." "Well, did you manage?" Mr. Westabrook asked. "Only once," Arthur answered. "If they get the smell of you, good night. But I read in a book here in the library how to work around so the wind wouldn't carry it. And one night, I watched a group feeding and tossing their horns nearly 5 minutes. "It is a pretty sight," Mr. Westabrook remarked. "I guess if I were a boy, I couldn't resist that myself. But I want you to promise me that you'll make these explorations only the 3 nights that the moon is full." Arthur promised readily. "Oh, Father," Maida begged, "couldn't I do it too?" Her father shook his head. "No, I guess you little girls must stay in your beds. Yes, you too, Dickie," as Dickie's lips opened automatically, "and you, Harold. Sometime, perhaps, but not now. Arthur is older and bigger. He can take care of himself. Now," he concluded quickly, as if determined to give envy no time to develop, "come out into the barn. I hear there's some good boxing going on here. Besides, I want you to show me how your tennis is improving." The little 6 continued to play near or in the house directly under Granny Flynn's or Mrs. Dorr's watchful eye. Occasionally they were permitted to wade in the lake, but only when one of the grown-ups accompanied them. For most of their time, they were contented to frequent Home Rock. Maida had told the little 6 that there were toys awaiting them in the little house. These included dolls of all sizes, doll furniture, little sets of dishes, china, and pewter. Granny eked these out with the store of the saucerless cups and the cupless saucers, the cracked bowls and plates, which linger on the outskirts of all respectable china closets. The children were permitted to carry pails of water over to House Rock, and there, in its shade, miniature housekeeping began. From every level, glassy-eyed dolls sitting placidly in little chairs or lying placidly in little beds surveyed the landscape. Every morning, the small mothers burst into an orgy of house cleaning, sweeping rock rooms, dusting doll furniture, washing doll dishes. Every afternoon, there broke out a fury of baking. Hundreds of delicious mud pies were mixed, baked, and then abandoned to that limbo to which all mud pies are sooner or later consigned. When this play gave out, the ingenious Mrs. Dorr set them to cut out paper dolls, and to making, in scrapbooks hastily improvised from brown paper, innumerable rooms furnished with advertisement furniture cut from magazines. This involved endless hours of cutting in which scissors disappeared as though by witchcraft and reappeared as though by magic. Endless hours of pasting from which the small interior decorators returned splashed with flour paste from head to foot. When in turn this game lost its savor, the resourceful Mrs. Dorr designed paper houses. These architectural wonders, made from the endless piles of rejected paper boxes which the under-the-eaves closets of the little house contained. The little 6 were as much delighted with the little house and its neighborhood as the big 6. But unlike the big 6, with the exception of Betsy, they were content with nearby joys. But Betsy had never recovered from her tendency to run away. Once or twice, she slipped off the house rock and started to make through the green forests in any direction that occurred to her. But she was always caught. Caught because after her first straying, Mrs. Dorr put on the efficient little Molly the burden of keeping a watch on her. And Molly watched Betsy, watched her with the same quiet, supervising care which she had always brought to her guardianship of the self-willed, stubborn Timmy. After a while, astute Betsy came to realize that a guard was always near, and for the time being ceased to stray. "She'll do it sometime," Dickie prophesied again and again. "She always has, and she always will." The children recovered from their first attack of sunburn, but they succumbed to another and another. The second attack was not so painful, and the third was scarcely noticed. The red in their faces deepened to a brown, which was like the protection of armor against the sun. The blue-eyed and fair-haired ones, Maida and the two Lathrops, freckled, but Rosie turned a deeper rose bronze every day. Dickie was fast changing to the color of a coffee bean, and Arthur threatened to become pitch black. As for the little six, Maida said they were just colonies of freckles, and colonies in which layer had grown on layer. "I can't believe you're the same children I saw in the city a little over 2 weeks ago," Buffalo Westerbrook remarked on his second visit. "First, I was afraid you were working too hard. When Maida sent me the program of your work, it looked to me as if you were undertaking altogether too much, but you certainly thrive on it." "Well, we play more than we work," Rosie explained. "I never was so hungry in all my life," Laura declared, "and I fall asleep the moment my head touches the pillow." "All right," Buffalo Westerbrook laughed. "You're doing so well, I'll leave it all in your hands." He always surveyed both the flower garden and the vegetable garden when he came, surveyed them with much interest. He always went into the barn and made an examination of the boys' quarters. And so, with work and play, July wore itself away. Chapter 12. Betsy's Find. The Big Six, as the older children were now called, were returning from their swim. A shower early in the morning had delayed the bathing hour until afternoon, and their pent-up spirits had exploded in prolonged skylarking in the water. It was late afternoon when they came in sight of the little house. They threw themselves under one of the twin elms on the front lawn, a little warm from their walk home. And as the Big Six languidly talked, the Little Six came, in single file, along the trail which led from House Rock. "Where's Betsy?" the sharp-eyed Rosie called. "I sent her back for her dolly," Molly exclaimed gravely. "She forgot and left Hildegard on House Rock. Hildegard was all dressed up in her best clothes, and I didn't think she ought to stay out all night long." "That's right, Molly," Maida applauded the little girl. "Take just as good care of your dollies as you do of yourselves, and then when you grow up, they'll still be with you, like Lucy." Molly, heading the file, turned suddenly and walked soberly over to Maida's side. She knelt down on the grass beside her. "Maida," she said, "when we first came down here, you said if we were very, very good, we could play with Lucy some rainy day." Maida laughed up into the earnest little face. The keynote of Molly's coloring was brown, just as Delia's was red, Betsy's black, and the Clark twins' pink and white. Molly's serious little face, from which hung two tight, thick little braids, had, even in her wee childhood, a touch of motherliness, and indeed she brooded like a warm little mother bird over the entire rest of the group. "So I did," Maida said. "But we've only had 3 rainy days," Molly complained. The Big Six laughed. Molly could not pronounce T, and her failure in this respect always entertained the Big Six. They all reached out and knocked the elm trunk. "Knock wood," they called to Molly, and Molly, not at all understanding what it was all about, obediently tapped the tree with her dimpled knuckles. "And you didn't let us have Lucy those free days," Molly said reproachfully. "But if you wait long enough, Molly," Maida excused herself, "you are sure to have a big 3-day storm, and I promise you shall have Lucy on all 3 days." "And the little hair frunk?" Molly questioned eagerly. "Yes," Maida agreed, "the little hair frunk." "Cross your throat?" Molly demanded. "Yes, cross my throat," Maida agreed and crossed it. "Oh, goody!" Molly skipped away on the wings of ecstasy. "Did Betsy come back?" Dickie asked carelessly. "I didn't notice," Maida answered absently. "I wasn't looking." But after a while the supper bell rang. The children filed into the dining room and took their places. One chair was vacant. "Where's Betsy?" Mrs. Dorr immediately asked. Everybody looked puzzled, and nobody answered. "I told her to go and get her dolly," Molly asserted. Nobody paid any attention to her. "She's probably upstairs in the nursery," Mrs. Dorr decided. "Once or twice she's fallen asleep up there. She's got so tired playing." She left the room, and the children heard her running over the stairs. In a moment or two, they heard her footsteps coming back at a swifter pace. "She isn't there," Mrs. Dorr said in a quiet voice, "nor in any one of the upstairs rooms. Now, before you eat, children, scatter about the place and see if you can find her." "She's run away," Dickie asserted. "I told you she would." "I told her to go back for her dolly," Molly reiterated gravely. As Mrs. Dorr had ordered, the children scattered. They searched the house, the annex, the barn, the treehouse, the 2 gardens, and the adjacent trails. No Betsy. By this time, Florabelle and Zeke, looking very serious, had joined in the search. Granny Flynn, obviously frightened, was wringing her hands. Mrs. Dorr's face had turned serious too, but she was quite mistress of herself. "We'll wait a few minutes," she ordered slowly, "and then if we haven't found her, we'll telephone the big house. In the meantime, Granny, you see that the children have their supper. The rest of you," she addressed the big 6, "must go without your supper for a while. I want your help." The big 6 wanted to help, of course. For a moment or two, they wandered about aimlessly, a haphazard group, with Mrs. Dorr and Florabelle and Zeke trying to direct all at once. Suddenly, Arthur Duncan took command of the situation. He ran into the house and emerged with his arms full of things. The cowbell, with which Florabelle called the children to meals, and 4 electric flashlights. "Laura," he commanded, handing her the cowbell, "I want you to stand here at the door and ring this bell at regular intervals. I'm going to divide the rest of you into pairs and send you off in different directions. We're losing time, all bunched together like this. Now, Mrs. Dorr, if you and Dickie will go to the magic mirror and hunt the woods there. And Florabelle, you and Rosie take the house rock direction. Zeke, you and Harold search in front across the road. Maida and I will beat the woods back of the house. Remember, don't any one of you go out of hearing of the bell. And if any of you find Betsy, come back and ring the bell hard without stopping. In the meantime, They searched every bit of ground thoroughly. At the foot of tree trunks, beside rocks, under bushes. Arthur thrust the rays of his electric flashlight. At intervals, he called to Maida, and at intervals Maida called to him. It grew darker and darker. There's the moon, Arthur said in a relieved tone. It's going to help a good deal having a full moon. Following his pointing finger, Maida caught a faint red glow through the trees. They searched a little longer. Arthur, I can barely hear the bell, Maida exclaimed suddenly. Arthur sighed. I was just thinking that, he said. I guess we'll have to go back to the little house and telephone the big house. They turned and walked in the direction of the cowbell. They were too preoccupied with the sense of their unhappiness to talk. Once only, Maida said, She's one of the darlingest little girls I ever knew. If anything happened to Betsy, and then how could we tell her mother? When they came out onto the lawn of the little house, they found Florabelle and Rosie sitting there. A minute later, Zeke and Harold appeared from one direction, and, after an interval, Mrs. Dorr and Dickie from another. They all had the same anxious, slightly terrified look. I'll call up the big house now, Mrs. Dorr said quietly. We can't handle this alone any longer. She started towards the door, and automatically the others followed in a silent, downcast file. And then, suddenly, Rosie screamed, There's Betsy now! The whole group turned, stood petrified. Maida followed Rosie's scream with, And what is she carrying in her arms? And then the whole group broke and ran in the direction of House Rock. Betsy was coming down the trail toward the little house. The moon was fairly high now, and it shone full on the erect little figure and the excited, sparkling little face. Her dress was soiled and torn. Her hair ribbon had gone, and her curls hung helter-skelter about her rosy cheeks. Her great eyes shone like baby moons as her gaze fell on the group running towards her. A trusting smile parted her red lips, showed all her little white mice teeth. She's carrying a fawn, Arthur exclaimed as he neared her. Why, it can't be a day old. Betsy was carrying a fawn. As they surrounded her, she handed it trustfully over into Arthur's extended hands. I finded it myself, she announced proudly. I ran and I ran and I ran, and it runned and it runned and it runned. But I ran faster than it runned, and pretty soon it was all tired out and I catched it. This was all of her adventure that they ever got out of Betsy. Conjecture later filled in these meager outlines. That Betsy had been coming home with her doll, Hildegard, when this stray from the Westerbrook preserves crossed her path. Dropping Hildegard, they found her a few minutes later not far from House Rock. She chased the poor little creature over trails, through bushes, across rocks, until she ran him down. Then picking him up in her arms, she found the path by some lucky accident and came home. Mother of God, Mrs. Dorr said, hugging Betsy again and again. The child looked like the young St. John coming down the path. Florabelle lifted Betsy in her arms and carried her the rest of the way, a very excited little girl proudly telling her story again and again. I ran and I ran and I ran, she kept repeating, and he runned and he runned and he runned. The other children tried to help in the process by holding on to dangling legs and arms, by patting the little thickly curly head, and by reaching up to kiss the round rosy cheeks, all except Arthur, who carried the exhausted little fawn. Once home, Betsy was the center of attention for only a moment. She was given her supper, a warm, soothing bath, and put immediately to bed. Then the fawn took the center of the stage. The capable Arthur found a big basket which he filled with soft cloths, placed the exhausted little creature in it. He was exhausted, for when Arthur first put him on the floor, his legs gave out under him. He spraddled, all 4 legs flat, on the rug in front of the fireplace, as Rosie said, exactly like a wet mosquito. Then Arthur heated some milk, dipped a corner of a handkerchief into it, gave it to the fawn to suck. It was a slow process, for the fawn did not seem to understand this strange method of being fed. At length, Arthur thought of a better scheme. Procuring an eyedropper from the medicine chest, he poured the warm fluid, drop by drop, into the little creature's mouth. All the time, the children knelt around the basket in a circle. "How sweet it is," Rosie, who adored animals, kept saying. "Look at its big eyes and its beautiful head." "I'd love to take him in my arms," Maida exclaimed again and again, "only I know I would frighten it to death. See how it trembles if we get too near." The little children, who had been allowed one glimpse of the deer, went upstairs chattering like little magpies. Betsy, tired with her long hunting, had fallen asleep the instant she struck the pillow, but the rest were in such a state of high excitement that it was almost an hour before the last of them calmed down. It was not easy that night to drive the big 6 to bed. When the denizens of the little house waked the next morning, their tiny forest guest was lying in his basket, bright-eyed as usual. For an hour after his breakfast and theirs, they hovered about him, making all kinds of plans in regards to his future. But these dreams were rudely shattered when Mrs. Dorr informed them that she had told Mr. Westerbrook over the phone the whole episode, and that he was sending a man that day to bring the deer back to the big house. "Oh, I don't see why we have to give him up," Maida declared in heartbroken accents. "What fun it would be to have a deer all our own and watch him grow. Just think when his horns came." "Oh, Maida," Rosie begged, "do call your father up and tease him to let us keep him. Just think of having a baby fawn running about the house." Added their entreaties to Rosie's. "I don't think it would be any use, Maida," Mrs. Dorr quietly interrupted. "Your father said if by chance any stranger brought a dog here, he would kill the little fawn the moment he caught him. And then, when the fawn himself grew bigger and developed horns, he might even be dangerous. Besides, Betsy," as Betsy burst into loud wails, "Mr. Westerbrook said he would send you something nice to take the fawn's place." "But the fawn's alive," Rosie said in a grieved tone, "and nothing can be as nice as a live creature." "He said this would be alive too," Mrs. Dorr comforted her. "Oh, what?" Rosie asked. Mrs. Dorr's eyes danced. "It's a surprise. I'm not to tell it." Only half appeased, the children hung around the house, waiting to see what the live thing was. In the middle of the morning, A runabout drew up in front of the little house, and one of Mr. Westerbrook's men alighted from it. He was wearing a long, loose coat, but he had nothing in his arms. He took the little fawn, basket and all, and placed it in the runabout. The children tagged his every movement, followed with their eyes his every motion. After the fawn was safely installed on the seat beside him, he turned on the engine. Betsy burst into tears. "Oh, that's the little girl," the man exclaimed, as though suddenly remembering something, "who found the fawn, isn't it?" Through her sobs, Betsy began, "I ran and I—" "Well then," the man said, "I guess I've got something for you." He reached into one of the pockets of his big coat and brought out a tiny, nondescript bundle of loose white fur, of helpless waving black paws, big bulging winking black eyes, a curly queue of a tail, an impertinent sniffing nose, a baby bulldog. He handed it to Betsy. Betsy's tears dried in a flash. She hugged the puppy close to her warm neck, ran with him to the house. The children raced after her, and the runabout, utterly forgotten, disappeared down the road. "Let's call it Fawn," Rosie said, and Fawn it was. Fawn adopted the little house as her home at once. She was a very affectionate person, and she soon grew to love devotedly every member of the household. They all loved her devotedly in return, but none loved her more than Betsy, and Betsy's dog she always remained. Chapter 13. Discovery. "Do you know, I think it would be fine if we went off some day this week on a picnic," Laura said unexpectedly one morning. "I just love to go on picnics, and we haven't had one yet." "Oh, Laura," Maida agreed ecstatically. "What a wonderful idea. I love picnics too. I adore picnic food, and I never yet have had all the hard-boiled eggs I want. How did you come to think of it?" "I thought of it last night just before I fell asleep," Laura's voice sparkled with pride. "It was all I could do to keep from going in your rooms and waking you and Rosie up to tell you about it. I was so excited that I couldn't fall asleep, and so I made a perfectly beautiful plan. I thought we might put up lunches, then get into our bathing suits, paddle across the magic mirror to the other side, and spend the day there. We have never really explored the other side. I'm sure it's perfectly lovely there, and we'll have a wonderful time." "Let's do it tomorrow," Rosie took up with Laura's plan immediately. "We can get up early, cook the eggs, and make the sandwiches. There'll be enough cake left over. And oh, listen, everybody. Remember not to forget the salt. People always forget the salt on picnics." "It's ice cream day tomorrow," Harold said sadly. "We'll miss it if we're not home to freeze it." "No, if you boys will get up early and make it, we can take it along in the freezer with us," Rosie suggested daringly. "Sure," Arthur was highly enthusiastic. "I don't care how early I have to get up to make ice cream. I'd rather do that than go without it." All other conversation was banished for the day. They kept thinking of the things they would like to take with them, and stopped only short of the bicycles. "I should think," Maida said once, "that we're going to Africa for 6 months at least. Remember one thing, though, don't forget the salt." They were so afraid that they wouldn't wake in time that they wound their alarm clocks to the very last notch. They did wake in time, however. In fact, they had to put the alarm clocks under the bedclothes and pile pillows on top of them to keep them from waking the rest of the household. With much whispering and much half-suppressed giggles, the girls managed to get into bathing suits, went downstairs, and began their work in the kitchen. Although the exact number of eggs and sandwiches had been decided on the day before, they held many low-toned conversations on the subject. "Remember," Laura said, "you can always eat twice as much at a picnic as anywhere else. I don't know why it is," she concluded thoughtfully, "but even things you don't like taste good. Be sure not to forget the salt." By the time Florabelle appeared to get their breakfasts, they were nearly famished, but nevertheless they ate hurriedly, so great was their longing to get off. Arthur shouldered the ice cream freezer. Between them, the girls carried the luncheon. The little children had to be led to the side of the house so as not to witness their elaborate, burden-laden departure. As it was acute, little Betsy apparently guessed that something was going on which did not include her. As the big six disappeared down the trail, they could hear Granny Flynn soothing her whimperings. It was a beautiful day. The sun was not yet high enough in the heavens for it to be hot. Indeed, dew still lay over everything, but there was a languor in the atmosphere, which warned them that it would be hot enough later. The pond was indeed a magic mirror. It was like glass. Not a ripple roughed its surface, and everything on the shore was so perfectly reflected that it looked painted on the water. The children wasted no time on the view. They pulled the 4 canoes out of the boathouse and began loading them. Arthur paddled alone in one with the ice cream freezer and the lunch. Harold paddled alone in the second with the rugs and the hammock. The others went 2 to a canoe. The little fleet kept close. "Isn't it a beautiful place?" Rosie asked joyously, trailing her hand in the water. "It's like fairyland today. How I wish I could see some fairies or goblins or something strange." "I'd be content to see some white peacocks," Dickie said soberly. "Oh, Dickie," Maida exclaimed, "I've never taken you to see the white peacocks as I promised. I'll do that as soon as I can." "I'd rather see some deer," Harold remarked. "Well, all I ask," Laura was very empathetic, "is not to see 2 people, Silva and Timma Burl." "I don't think we'll run into them," Maida declared thoughtfully. "It's a long time since any of us have seen them. Over 2 weeks, I should say. Perhaps they've gone away." "No," Arthur called from his canoe. "I saw them in the village yesterday." The landing was effected with no difficulty, although here, of course, there was no pier. They followed the trail through the woods for a long way, trying to find a place to camp. One spot attracted some, a second attracted others, but for a long time, no place attracted them all. "There are too many stones here," Rosie would say. "It won't be comfortable to sit down." "And it's too sunny here," Maida commented. "It'll melt the ice cream and the butter and everything." "That place slants," Laura made the third objection. "We want a nice flat spot." "I think I hear water," Dickie cried suddenly. "Water?" Maida repeated. "Water? How can you hear it? There's no water here. I never saw any brook around here. I can't hear any water." Neither could anybody else, yet Dickie persisted that he heard the sound of running water. "You wait here," he exclaimed suddenly. "Let me see if I can find it." He disappeared through the trees. He came running back in a few minutes, obviously excited. "I haven't found it yet," he explained, "but I certainly hear it plainer and plainer the farther I go." The others swarmed into the bushes. Dickie led the way. "I hear water," Rosie announced electrically. "Hark!" They all stopped and listened. One by one they got the soft tinkle. Encouraged, they kept on, rounding bushes and leaping rocks. The noise grew louder and louder. A rough trail suddenly appeared. They raced over it as fast as their burdens would permit. The sound was now a lovely musical splash. They came out on an open space, surrounded by pines and thickly carpeted with pine needles. At one side, a great rock thrust out of the earth. Close beside it ran a tiny brook, and just beyond the lee of the rock, the brook fell into a waterfall not more than a foot high. The children went wild with delight. "Do you mean to tell me, Maida Westerbrook, that you never knew this was here?" Rosie demanded. "I never did," Maida declared solemnly. "I've never seen it. I've never heard anybody mention it. Isn't it darling? What shall we call it? We must give it a name." Nobody had any names ready, and everybody was too excited to think. In fact, at once they began wading up and down the little brook. They explored the neighborhood. Not far off, they came upon a curious patch of country. A cleared circle, surrounded by pine trees and carpeted with pines, was filled with irregular lines of great rocks that lost themselves in the bushes on either side. "I believe this is a moraine," Maida exclaimed suddenly. "I've seen moraines in Europe." "What's a moraine?" the others asked. Maida explained how once the earth had been covered with great ice caps called glaciers, and how in melting these glaciers had often left, streaking the earth's surface, great files and lines of rock. "We'll ask Father to come here some day," she ended. "He'll know all about it. Billy Potter, too. He knows everything." After a while, they came back to the waterfall. They swept aside the pine needles, spread the tablecloth on the ground, took food from the baskets, set it about in an inviting pile. The ice cream had not melted an atom in the freezer. The sandwiches done up in wet napkins were quite fresh. The eggs looked as inviting as hard-boiled eggs are bound to look. Everything was all right except that, and this produced first consternation, then laughter. There was no salt. "We all reminded everybody else to remember the salt," Maida said in disgust, "and so nobody put it in the basket." Everybody but Rosie was busy, and Rosie, as though bewitched, was wandering about, gazing up this vista and down that one, examining clumps of bushes. "Come, Rosie, lunch is most ready," Maida called to her. And as Rosie didn't answer, "What are you doing?" "I'm looking for—" Rosie's voice was muffled. "I thought I saw something. Oh, come, see what I found." Now her voice was sharp and high with excitement. The children rushed pell-mell in the direction of the voice. Rosie had gone farther than they thought. Indeed, she had disappeared entirely. She had to keep calling to guide them, When they came to her at last, she was standing with her back against a tree, the look on her face very mystified, holding in her arms a doll, Maida exclaimed. Who could have dropped it? Nobody ever comes here but us. It was a cheap little doll of rag, perfectly clean and dry. How did you come to find it? Laura inquired. Well, it's the strangest thing, Rosie answered in a queer, quiet voice. I was just poking around here, not thinking of anything particularly. And then I thought I saw something moving, a white figure. I started towards it, and then it seemed to me that something was thrown through the air. Now, when I try to remember, I can't be sure I really did see something thrown through the air, and yet I sort of feel that I did. Anyway, I ran to see what it was. When I got there, this doll was lying in the path. How curious, Maida commented. You must have imagined the figure, Rosie. See, there's nobody here. A little odd, the children stared through the trees, this way and that, but they stood stock still. Yeah, I must have imagined it, Rosie admitted. Still, when I try to make myself believe I didn't see anything, something inside of me tells me I did. Let's look about, Arthur suggested. They scattered exploring, diving into bush clumps and peering behind rocks. 15 minutes went by. Well, we found nothing. Arthur ended the search as he had begun it. Let's go back and eat lunch. Oh, let's, begged Harold. I never was so hungry in all my life. Nor I, came from the others. Maida alone remained thoughtful. She led the file, however, back to the waterfall. And it was she who suddenly stopped and called. Look what's happened. She stopped as though her breath had given out. Chapter 14, The Terror. In the midst of the clearing, the paper tablecloth still lay on the ground, a great shining rectangle of white, scattered about, crumpled, soiled, or torn with paper napkins. Everything else, even the ice cream from the freezer, had disappeared. Why, who took it? Arthur demanded in a dazed voice. Who could have taken it? He went on in a puzzled one. Is any one of you playing a joke? He asked suddenly of the others. Everybody protested his innocence. We haven't been gone more than 15 minutes, Arthur went on. Let's look about. It doesn't seem to me anybody could have carried all that stuff far, and we not get a glimpse of it. It might be tramps. One thing is certain, Maida protested. Tramps didn't do it. There are never any tramps in Scituate. The children started their search. They talked the matter over, but instinctively their voices lowered. They kept glancing over their shoulders. They found nothing. It's like magic, Maida commented in a still voice. You were saying, Rosie, that you wished you could see some fairies or goblins. It looks to me as though the goblins have stolen our lunch. Arthur alone did not leave the clearing. He stood in the center, pivoting about, watching every vista and gnawing his underlip. His face was more perplexed than any of them had ever seen it. Well, if we don't find our lunch pretty soon, he said after a while, we've got to go back home to get something to eat. Perhaps somebody's playing a joke on us, Rosie suggested. And if we wait for a while, they'll bring the lunch back. There seemed nothing else to do. So, rather sobered by this mysterious event, The children seated themselves in a group by the brook. "I can't wait very much longer," Laura admitted dolefully. "I'm nearly starved. I was so excited about the picnic that I hardly ate any breakfast." "Just a few minutes more," Arthur begged. "Maida, please tell us a story." Once upon a time, Maida began obligingly. 6 boys and girls were cast away on a great forest with nothing to eat. It was a forest filled with gob. "Hark!" she interrupted herself. "What's that?" From somewhere, not the forest about them, nor the sky above it, it seemed actually to issue from the earth under them, came a strange moaning cry. The children jumped to their feet. The boys started apart. The girls clung together. The cry grew louder and louder. It was joined by a second voice, even more strange, and then a third entered the chorus. It was too much. The little group, white-faced and trembling, broke and made for the trail. The girls started first. The boys stood still, but as the uncanny sound grew louder and louder, soared higher and higher, they became panic-stricken too. They ran. Arthur, ending the file, walked at first, but finally even his walk grew into a run. The others leaped forward. They bounded over the trail, gaining in terror as they went. In some way, they got into the canoes, but 6 times their trembling and fumbling nearly spilled them out. It was not until they were well into the middle of the magic mirror that their composure came back. "What do you suppose it was?" Maida asked, white-faced. "It couldn't have been a ghost, could it?" dropped from Laura's shaking lips. "No," Arthur dismissed this theory with complete contempt. "I should think it was a crazy person," Harold declared. "Is there a lunatic asylum around here, Maida?" "No," Maida replied. "Is there any crazy person about here?" Maida shook her head. "I think it was a tramp who first stole our lunch," Arthur guessed shrewdly, and then decided to frighten us away. "I think the wood is haunted," Rosie shivered. "Nonsense," Maida exclaimed. "Well, I wish I hadn't run away," Arthur burst out impatiently. "I wish I'd stayed." "So do I, Arthur," Maida agreed vigorously. "That's the first time I ever ran away from anything in my life." "Let's go back," Arthur suggested. Laura burst into tears. "Oh, please don't," she begged. "I'm frightened to death." "We won't go, Laura," Maida reassured her. "Don't worry." She continued after an interval of thought. "And don't let's tell Granny Flynn and Mrs. Dorr about that screaming. Let's say that our lunch was stolen while we were away. If I tell them all of it, they won't let us go on another picnic." "Well, believe me, I don't want to go on another picnic," Laura said, her eyes streaming still. However, by the time they had reached the jetty and had tethered the canoes, they were more composed. When they reached the little house, even Laura had begun to smile, to admit that the tramp theory was probably the correct one. Granny Flynn and Mrs. Dorr looked very much concerned when they heard the story. They asked many questions. Finally, they decided with Arthur that tramps were the answer to the strange happening. Maida persisted, though, that tramps were never permitted in Scituate. The next morning, Arthur strolled down to the lake alone. In a little while, he came running back, white with rage. "What do you suppose has happened?" he called while still running up the trail. "We didn't lock the canoes in the boathouse last night, and somebody has made a great hole in all 4 of them." The big 6 rushed down to the magic mirror. It was only too true. 4 of the canoes were ruined. The children stood staring at them, horrified. "I don't think tramps would do this," Arthur said slowly. "They'd steal them, but there'd be no sense in destroying them." "No," Maida said slowly. "This looks as though we had an enemy who is determined to make us as unhappy as possible." Chapter 15, Arthur's Adventure. It was after 11 on a cloudless night. The great white moon filled the sky with light, covering the earth with a thin film of silver. The barn door opened slowly and noiselessly. Arthur emerged, patting the grass as quickly as possible, moving in the direction of the trail. For a while, he proceeded swiftly, but once out of hearing of the little house, he moved more slowly without trying to deaden his footsteps. It was clear that his excursion had a purpose from the way he moved steadily forward. The magic mirror was his objective. He dipped into the bosky dingle, and there, perhaps because the air was so densely laden with flower perfumes, he stopped. Only for an instant, though. After sniffing the air like a wild creature, he continued on. Presently, he came out on the shore of the lake. Taking a key from his pocket, he opened the little boathouse where the canoes were locked each night since the accident. He pulled one out and shoved it into the water. He seated himself and started to paddle across the pond. Curiously enough, he did not paddle straight across the magic mirror. He kept close to the edge, as though afraid of being seen, slipping under overhanging boughs and taking advantage of every bit of low drooping bush. His progress was so stealthy and silent that he might not have been observed at all from the middle of the lake. However, this was a slow method. It was nearly midnight when he reached the point opposite the boathouse, his apparent destination. He stopped short of it, tied the canoe to a tree trunk where a half-broken bough concealed it completely, and stepped lightly ashore. Apparently, he had landed here before. A little side trail, revealed under the moonlight, led in the direction of the main trail. He took it. Now his movements were attended by much greater caution. He went slowly, pacing his feet with the utmost care even in the cleared portions of the trail. Wherever underbrush intervened, he took great care to skirt it, or with a quiet leap or a long straddle to surmount it so that no sound came from his movement. It was surprising, in a boy so lumbering and with large hands and feet, how delicately he picked his way. He moved with extraordinary speed and surprising quiet. A little distance up the trail, he turned again. This time, he took a path so faint that only a full moon would reveal its existence. Arthur followed it with perfect confidence. At times, it merged with underbrush and low trees, but he must have previously blazed a path through those obstacles, as he made his way without hesitation for the only spot which offered egress, emerging on the other side with the same quiet and dispatch. He went on, proceeding with greatly increased speed, but with no diminution of his caution. After a while, He came into cleared land that surrounded the big house for many acres. Now he moved like a shadow, but at a brisk pace. He had the confident air of one familiar with the lay of the land. After a while, he reached a wide avenue of trees. Mr. Westabrook had taught him its French name, an allée. This was one of 5, all beginning at the big house and ending with a fountain or a statue. Arthur proceeded under the shade of the trees until he came out near the big house. He swung himself up among the branches of a tree, found a comfortable crotch, and seated himself with his back against the trunk. With a forked stick, he parted the branches and watched. The moon was high, and as the night was still cloudless, it poured white fire over the earth. The great lawn in front of the big house looked like silvered velvet. Halfway down its length, the fountain still played into its white marble basin. 4 swans, great feathery heaps of snow, slept with their heads under their wings, moored against the marble sides of the basin. As Arthur stared, a faint perturbation stirred the air, as though a motor had come to rest unseen by him. Presently, a high, slim dog, a Russian boarhound, came sauntering across the lawn. He poked his nose into the basin of the fountain. One of the swans made a low, sleepy cry, moved aimlessly about for an instant, then came to rest in sleep apart from his companions. The hound moved into the shrubbery, then returned to the lawn. As if the swan's call or the dog's nosing had evoked it, one of the white peacocks emerged from the woods, spreading his tail with a superb gesture of pride and triumph. The long white hound considered the display gravely. The peacock, proudly strutting, sauntered over the velvet surface of the lawn alone. Then a companion joined him, followed by another. Finally, 3 great snowy sails floated with majestic movement across the grass. The display ended as suddenly as it began. One of the trio suddenly returned to the trees. The other 2 followed immediately. The lawn was deserted except for the fountain, which kept up its exquisite plaint. The boarhound sped noiselessly towards the house. Arthur waited for a moment, then slipped down from the tree and made his way back. But he did not follow the same trail. He made a detour that would take him further around the lake, and if he seemed cautious before, now he was caution itself. He moved so slowly and carefully that no human could have known of his approach unless they had eyes, ears, or a nose superhumanly acute, and Arthur had his reward. Suddenly, he came to an opening that gave past a little covert onto a glade. At the end of the glade, a group of deer were feeding in the moonlight. Arthur did not move after discovering them. He seemed scarcely to breathe. There were nearly a dozen. The bucks and does pulled delicately at the brush foliage. The fawns grazed on the grass. Despite Arthur's caution, instinct told them something was wrong. The largest buck was the first to sense it. He stopped feeding, lifted his head, and sniffed the air suspiciously. Then one of the does caught the sense of danger. She too lifted her head, and for what seemed a long time, tested the atmosphere with her dilated nostrils. Then the others, one by one, showed signs of restlessness. only the little fawns continued to feed placidly at their mother's sides. But apparently, the consensus of the adults was too strongly in favor of retreat. For an instant, the adults moved anxiously. Then suddenly, as though the word of alarm had been whispered into every velvety ear, dash, flash, a series of white gleams from their tails, and the glade was empty as if there were no deer within 100 miles. Arthur went on, and now, as though hoping for another reward of his patience, he moved with even greater care. But for a long time, nothing happened. In the meantime, clouds came up, occasionally covering the moon. Then, with the light gone, the great harbors and white straits between the clouds seemed to fill with stars. The moon would start to emerge, her light silvery everything. The smaller stars would retreat, leaving only a few big ones to flare. Such an obscuration had come. While the moon struggled to pull herself free, a second cloud interposed itself. The world turned dark, almost black. The effect on Arthur was to make him pick his way with even greater care. The trail here was not a blind one. It ran into the path that led from the gypsy camp to the moraine. Ahead, Arthur could just make out the point where the trails crossed. Suddenly, the moon came out with a great vivid flare, as though an enormous searchlight had been turned on the earth. Something, just a ghost of a sound, arrested Arthur's footsteps. He stopped, stood stock still, listened, watched. Something or someone was coming up the trail from the direction of the gypsy camp. In a moment, they would pass the opening. It sounded human, for the sound was of human footsteps. They came nearer and nearer. A straight light figure, with hair that gleamed as though burnished, passed into the moonlight. It was Sylvia Burrell. Sweet dreams, my friend. Sleep well.